Hello and welcome. In this video, I wanted to take a look at the forces of the Death Guard and the Thousand Sons and how they've changed going into the chapter approved for Ark of Omens. Their changes are not too extensive, so I figure I could put them both in the same video and cover them rather quickly. With that being said, let's dive right in and start with the Death Guard. The Death Guard did see a rather big change in that Armor of Contempt is no longer part of the rule set, meaning they no longer benefit from that reduced armor penetration. This is actually a pretty big deal, as it does reduce their survivability, and Death Guard really do depend on being a survivable army that can be very tanky and very resilient. In addition to that, their lack of mobility really does benefit from Armor of Contempt, so losing such a universal rule that took the rather good resilience and made it something incredible is definitely going to hurt them as an army as a whole. However, I don't think it's quite as bad as some people are making it out to be. And with that being said, before I discuss what I think about Death Guard as a whole, let's take a look at the other changes that the Death Guard experienced so that we can better understand where the Death Guard are and where I'm coming from with some of my opinions. So with that being said, let's take a look at the different point changes that the Death Guard had. The first changes we'll look at are the HQ choices, which didn't see any particularly impressive changes. However, the Chaos Lord and the Chaos Lord and Terminator armor, as well as the Sorcerer and Terminator armor, now get all of their war gear for free, so now your cheapest option in terms of points cost for an HQ choice did get a little bit cheaper, and we have seen in the past where some people have ran these just to keep their points cost kind of low. However, that being said, I don't think it's really going to impact how you play the game. It's just a little bit of a perk if you do go for that low cost option, and mostly something you can kind of ignore. Moving on, we come to a troop choice, and the troop choice once again didn't see much of a change. However, Plague Marines did go down 2 points per model, going from 21 points a model to 19 points a model. This definitely helps them out a little bit and does give you a little bit of a points break. It's not the biggest change in the world, and really in the long run, you're only saving enough to get a few extra models within your list, so you're pretty much not going to feel the impact of this too extensively. However, even though it's kind of a minor benefit, it does add up over time and can help you include some additional units to really kind of bolster your list. With that being said, the only other change that the troop choice saw was that cultists now get their war gear upgrades for free, which for the most part isn't really that big of a deal considering you usually didn't take cultists within Death Guard, and you mostly focused on something like the Poxwalkers when you did want a more inexpensive troop choice, and as such I don't think it's really going to influence how you play Death Guard. Moving on to Elite Choice, we see where some more changes occurred, and the Elite Choice did see some good changes, which I do think are rather good, and let's start out with the one I think that's the most impactful, that I think a lot of people haven't really looked at. This being that Blight Lord Terminators now get their war gear for free in the same vein as Plague Marines did in the past. This is actually a pretty good change, as Blight Lord Terminators have been seeing less and less play, though they do still pop up within lists every now and then. This means now that you have a much easier time including them, and you can take things like flails and things like Reaper autocannons, as well as blight launchers on different units of Blight Lords, and give yourself some reach in terms of how your firepower is allocated, so that you're not quite as reliant on being within close combat as you would with some of those Plague Marine forces. Granted, Plague Marines do have access to some of the similar weapons. However, one thing to keep in mind now that Armor of Contempt is gone, it's good to have the option to take those Blight Lords without having to spend excessive amounts of points on the different war gear, and thus you can kind of mitigate some of the losses from Armor of Contempt by utilizing Blight Lords where you would normally utilize Plague Marines. This isn't going to necessarily warp how your list builds altogether, but it's definitely a good change, and I definitely think it's one that can give the Blight Lords a lot more room to play within the game, and can definitely help you offset some of those Armor of Contempt changes. And now I would have liked to have seen maybe the Blight Lords go down in points a little bit, but I also understand that their points cost is not the worst in the world, and they're already a reasonably powerful unit, so maybe this is enough to really kind of bring them back into the meta. The Death Shroud Terminators also saw a bit of a power boost as well. Now they get the Chimes of Contagion for free instead of having to pay the points for them. This means they're going to be getting an extra 3 inches to their contagion range, which is very nice, and you're no longer really forced into the next World Plague Company as you were in the past because of the Armor of Contempt. So while losing Armor of Contempt definitely hurts them, they do gain a little more benefit of being able to be a little more offensive, thanks to the fact that now they're not competing with Armor of Contempt as much, and they have the ability to extend their contagions, thus debuffing your enemy units, giving them a little bit more ability to be more aggressive and a little more powerful. And don't forget that the Terminator units do have the ability to teleport strike into the game from the strategic reserves, which does give them more mobility than they would otherwise have, and does help mitigate some of the mobility issues that Death Guard may experience. And not only that, but their durable profile is once again a little bit of a mitigation towards some of the loss of Armor of Contempt. As for other elite changes, there have been a lot of points drops on the different voted variants, though once again these are kind of minor in nature, with the Biologus Putrefier going down 5 points, now coming in at 60 points. Definitely a good unit that's made slightly better by this change. The Foul Blightspawn saw a bit more of a points decrease, and going down a total of 10 points, down to 80 points now. And while the Blightspawn is definitely a very good unit, he has been falling out of favor a little bit, so it's good to see him getting a bit more of an aggressive points reduction, thus allowing him to see a little more play going into the future. And I do think this is a good change overall, because the Foul Blightspawn is just a great model, and it's something that you're going to want to include in a lot of your lists. Thus, once again, it's one of those points drops that kind of adds up over time. And following the Blightspawn, the Tallyman has also seen a 5-point drop, going down to 65 points. The Plague Surgeon saw a drop of 5 points, going down to 70 points, and the Noxious Blightbringer saw a 5-point drop, going down to 55 points. I think the only one of these that kind of really matters is the Tallyman, as the Tallyman was a pretty good unit, and now it's just all the better, considering all of the things that the Tallyman does between tallying for a unit and helping you gain some command points throughout the game, when command points are a premium even in Arks of Omen. That being said, the latter two folded variants are a bit of a disappointment, as something like the Plague Surgeon would have been a really nice inclusion now that the Armor of Contempt is gone, but considering he's still 70 points, it's definitely kind of hard to justify his inclusion, and definitely makes it kind of difficult to find room within a list for him, even with all the different points drops. The Noxious Blightbringer, on the other hand, might have a little more room to run, considering now that he's only 55 points, but once again, I wish they made these two models aggressively cost enough that you would like to include them and not feel like you're losing much for doing so. Considering that they haven't really seen any serious play since the 9th edition rules came out, it's unfortunate to see that these two interesting models just kind of don't have room to play within the current meta, and maybe if they continue cutting their points, they'll eventually see some play as they're not the worst models in the world. However, they are a little bit overcosted for what they do, and they can be a little difficult to use at times, simply due to their limitations. And as such, I think they really kind of didn't go far enough with them. Anyway, that being said, we move on to the final elite choice that has changed, this being the Hellbrute, and now for the Hellbrute, all of its war gear is free, except for the Twin Las Cannon, which is now only 10 points. I actually kind of really like this change, as the Hellbrute did see some really fringe play, and now that he's actually significantly cheaper, due to the points cost on his different war gear options, I think you might actually start seeing the Hellbrute pop up a little bit more within play, as you have a lot of different ways of arming him and making him rather effective. That being said, the Hellbrute does have some issues in terms of durability and other such aspects, so there still might not be enough room for him to see play, even at his new and reduced points cost. I think there's definitely potential for this unit to kind of pop up more often than he did in the past, which was actually really uncommon to see in the first place. However, I still think they should have been a little more aggressive with a unit such as the Hellbrute, just to incentivize people to play it, as it's a really nice model, but it still lacks a little bit of that excitement factor and doesn't necessarily play into what the Death Guard want to do. That being said, maybe he'll see some more play, but I kind of doubt it, so don't hold your breath on this one. With all of the elite choices being covered, we can move on to fast attack choices. I think the fast attack choices had some very interesting changes, and ones that I haven't really seen too many people talk about. The fast attack choices have definitely seen some good points reduction, and we'll start out with kind of the least interesting one, being that the Chaos Spawn went down 2 points, now being 21 points per model. The Chaos Spawn saw very minimal play within the Death Guard forces, but they did pop up once in a while, so if you took them in the past and you plan to take them in the future, you've definitely gone a little bit more of a discount, and once again, don't forget you've seen discounts across most of your units, so those discounts will add up over time. As for the next change within the fast attack choices, the Folded Bloat Drone has also seen a bit of a decrease, not necessarily directly, but its war gear is now all free to take, so it definitely gives you more optionality in how you equip your Folded Bloat Drone and what you do with that model. I still think the Flesh Mower is probably going to be one of the better options, but at least now you have a lot more justification for taking the Heavy Blight Launcher, or even the other option, which kind of escapes my mind at this point in terms of what it's called, but I think it's the Plague Spewer or something of that nature, which is a Flamer style weapon. In either case, definitely a good change and definitely gives you more ability to experiment with what's kind of an interesting unit. And then following the Folded Bloat Drone comes the blight-hauler. The blight-hauler is down to 110 points per model. This seems kind of crazy to me, as the blight-hauler is actually a rather powerful model, and has a rather powerful profile with its multi-melta missile launcher and even melee profile. In addition to that, it's actually rather durable and has the ability to kind of survive rather effectively throughout the game. I think it's definitely going to be one of those models that's rather powerful, and that's going to be rather good going into the meta. In fact, the fast attack choice is kind of what makes me think Death Guard are being a little bit underrated, as there have been Death Guard lists that have done rather well that were pretty much nothing but blight-haulers, folded bloat drones, and things like the Plague Burst Crawler, so all of a sudden you can include more of them within your list, and they're easier to include alongside other Death Guard forces. As such, I think some of the points drops across the blight-haulers and things like the folded bloat drone, as well as the changes to the blight lords, and even the points drops on all the things like folded variants and plague marines are definitely going to add up to give you a little bit more power than people are assuming at first glance. Anyway, with that being said, let's move on to the heavy support choices. The heavy support choices saw a bit of a change as well, with all of the different upgrades on the generic Chaos Space Marine tanks, such as the Predator and the Land Raider, now being free, except for the last cannons, which are now 10 points on the Predators. This is a nice change and definitely something that really needed to happen a long time ago, but would I take a Predator over a Plaguebear's Crawler? Probably not, and unless you just happen to have one laying around and just want to kind of fit it into a list, I wouldn't really suggest taking it over a Plaguebear's Crawler or other options within the Death Guard forces. Unfortunately, the Predator still stays on the sideline, but something like the Land Raider did see occasional play, so in that situation, you do have a little bit more opportunity to run one of them and be a little more effective, though I still don't think it's necessarily the best option. And in terms of generic tanks for the Chaos Space Marines, the Defiler also saw a bit of a change as well, now being 175 points baseline, but all of its war gear is free. This definitely makes the Defiler a little bit more of an interesting choice, as all of a sudden you just pick up a Defiler and arm it with the best war gear possible, and it's always going to be that 175 points, so overall it did see a bit of a points reduction than if you just bought all the war gear individually for the Defiler in most situations, but I still think it's maybe a little bit overcosted. Maybe if it was 170 points, the Defiler would be a lot more interesting, or maybe even go really hard with it and make it cost 160 points, as it is kind of an interesting model and it does kind of give Chaos a unique identity. However, as it stands, I still don't necessarily think I want a Defiler in a list. I'd rather just kind of include other options, whether it's those Mephitic blight-haulers, folded bloat drones, or Plaguebear's Crawlers. They all just feel a little bit better to me and a little more interesting for what you get for the points. And you can even consider other things in that vein as well, so maybe it just needs a little more tweak, or maybe you might see one or two pop up here and there, sort of like the Hellbrute now that the points are a little bit better, but I still don't think it's something that you're going to see in every list and very ubiquitously. And finally, the last few changes are that the Rhino for the Death Guard forces gets all of its war gear for free, making the Rhino a little bit more efficient and a little bit more interesting. Not something that's really going to change whether you include a Rhino or not if you weren't planning to already, but it definitely helps out when you do include one, as it gives you a little bit more ability to make use of that Rhino as opposed to just kind of using it as a transport. In either case, I think it's a fine change, and I always like seeing a little bit more optionality in terms of war gear when it's available in this way, where it doesn't really skew how powerful the unit is, but it does give you more ability to kind of play around with different things. As for the last and final change, that being to the Miasmic Malignifier, which is now 65 points, down from 75 points. And I'll be honest, I don't really know what this thing does particularly well, as I've never really considered it, and I don't think this points drop is really going to make me change how I consider it. So at the end of the day, I think it's going to be one of those things that continues to not really see play, but maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it's better than I'm thinking. I just kind of haven't really ever thought about it, and a drop of 10 points on something that never saw any play doesn't really excite me to really look into it that much either. Again, maybe I'm missing out, but I kind of think that most of these terrain pieces just aren't powerful enough, and for the most part just aren't really seeing any kind of play because they're just not bringing that much to the table compared to anything else you can take for the points cost. Though that being said, 65 points isn't that much, so maybe I'll give it a second look. Anyway, with that being said, we kind of cover all of the different changes, and now we can kind of return to what I think about the Death Guard as a whole. I definitely think the Death Guard do have some serious issues, and if you're really spamming Plague Marines, you might have a much harder time now because you've lost that Armor of Contempt that really lets you be very durable, whereas now you're a lot more vulnerable to a lot more attacks, and the slow nature of the Death Guard definitely allows your opponent to outplay you in a lot of situations. That being said, do consider that the Death Guard did gain some advantages within this chapter approved as well. The first ones, as I mentioned, they did see points reductions on so many different units that it will add up over time within your army list, because sure, it's only 2 points per model on the Plague Marines and only 5 points on the Folded Varions, as well as changes here and there, it does add up over the course of a list. In addition to that, the Death Guard did not have the best armor penetration to begin with, considering that things like the Flail of Corruption, the Flesh Mower, the Blight Launcher, the Reaper autocannons, and many other weapons that the Death Guard have in large numbers only have about 2 armor penetration, and as such, the lack of Armor of Contempt on enemy units does help the Death Guard take out enemy units much more effectively, thus it's a bit of a double-edged sword, whereas the Death Guard before had maybe a little bit of difficulty with some of their offensive capabilities. They all of a sudden have a lot more ability to kind of leverage some of their better weapons, and considering that the war gear is free now on those Blight-Lord Terminators, you can definitely kind of take a bit more of a resilient style unit, even though it's going to drive up the points cost of your list as a whole. You're able to kind of mitigate that through the points decreases in other units, and thus kind of mitigate some of the losses, as I mentioned before, of things like Armor of Contempt. However, you will definitely be a lot more squishier than you were in the past. That being said, the other big thing that kind of hurts Death Guard a lot is their lack of mobility and their lack of heavy firepower. However, these two things are kind of made up by the fact that the Mephitic blight-hauler is so much more expensive now, and you have so much more versatility on those folded bloat drones. All of a sudden, you're kind of getting access to a rather powerful unit that's actually rather mobile at 10 inches, and that's not really a slow profile considering that the Mephitic blight-hauler does have that multi-melta, in addition to the missile launcher which can fire the crack missiles, which do have an armor penetration of 2, as well as a melee profile with 2 armor penetration. So once again, the loss of armor of contempt on enemy models does definitely help those profiles out on the Mephitic blight-hauler as well. And that's why I'm kind of optimistic on the Death Guard in comparison to what a lot of other people have said. I think the Death Guard have just enough depth within their codex where you can find some of these more extreme lists that we've seen in the past that have definitely gone a little bit better, and you're not necessarily pigeonholed into simply Plague Marine spam like a lot of players assume in many situations. Also do remember that in a lot of situations, even tournaments are not as competitive as people make them out to be, and a lot of local tournaments are going to be a lot more casual than some of the more refined top tier lists that we've seen both on this channel and in other places. I've even covered some lists that were completely unoptimized and still finished kind of in the middle of the pack. More so if you're a Death Guard player and you're very much despairing where your army is at the time, a little bit of an anecdote that I can share is that even though AdMech was seen as an incredibly weak army in the previous chapter approved, there were still a lot of very good AdMech players producing some level of results, and those players were still able to make rather good finishes, even with an army that was incredibly weak and incredibly pigeonholed into a specific style of play. So at the end of the day, just because an army is not necessarily the strongest within the meta, don't let that discourage you from playing what you enjoy, as if you're very passionate about something and you really stick with it, you can definitely find things that other people have missed, because 40k is an incredibly complicated game, and you can still perform rather well, because remember, at the end of the day, your opponent who's maybe not used to playing against some of the lower tier armies is going to have a harder time reacting to what you're capable of, as well as they might underestimate your capabilities, so ultimately there are benefits to playing kind of a weaker army. In either case, I think Death Guard are going to be better than people are expecting, and that's kind of my contrarian pick for this chapter approved, though I've been wrong in the past about such things, so we'll see where things end up, and it'll be kind of interesting to see if I end up being vindicated or if I'm just kind of wrong in this one. In either case, don't let it discourage you whether it's the best or the worst faction. If you enjoy it, the rules will change over time, and you will once again have an army that's rather good. So it's more important to enjoy the models and what you can do with the army than chasing something that'll only be valid for a total of 3 months before it changes once again. Anyway, with that being said, we conclude with our coverage with the Death Guard. And before we move on to 1,000 Suns, I'd like to say if you're in the United States and looking for a place to buy models, do check out the link in the description down below or visit venturetradeco.com. It's a website I started up where I sell Warhammer 40k, Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, and many other games. So when you buy models from that website, you do help support the channel and you're getting models for cheaper than Games Workshop sells directly on their web store. In any case, if you do check it out and you do buy something, thank you very much, I really appreciate it. And now back to our coverage of the 1,000 Suns. The 1,000 Suns are definitely hurt by the loss of the Armor of Contempt, as well as some changes within their secondary objectives. That being said, I do think the 1,000 Suns are still a little bit better off than the Death Guard overall at the end of these changes. Mostly that being because the 1,000 Suns do not rely as much on their tanky profiles as the Death Guard did. They still have options to become very tanky, however they have a little bit more ways of distributing that tankiness in ways that are a little bit different than fully relying on being a very resilient army, as well as they have a lot of tricks to have much more mobility and have a lot of ability to generate quite a ton of mortal wounds, which does give them more flexibility to navigate through the game as a whole. Not only that, but once again, the loss of Armor of Contempt on enemy units does benefit them in a lot of different ways, considering that a lot of their weapons that are commonly seen do not have the highest armor penetration. In addition to that, their basic weapons, being the Infernal Bolt Guns and things of that nature, do have a little bit of armor penetration in their basic profile, which does benefit from the loss of Armor of Contempt. However, unlike Death Guard, which benefit on a lot of their weapon profiles as well, the 1,000 Suns were not as reliant on this armor penetration due to their mortal wound generation on all of their different sorceress units. That being said, the 1,000 Suns did see a lot less changes on their different units in terms of points, so it does kind of balance out in that sense, and I do think they're going to be a little bit weaker than they were in the previous chapter approved. So let's take a look at the different point changes of the 1,000 Suns. We'll start off with the HQ choice as we did in the past. Just like the Death Guard, the only thing that really saw changes were kind of the more generic style of units, that being that the Sorcerer, Exalted Sorcerer, and Sorcerer in Terminator armor now get all of their war gear for free, which is a nice little benefit. However, I should mention that the Exalted Sorcerer does not get the Disc of Tzeentch for free and still has to pay full value for that. That's a bit of a bummer, but hey, at the end of the day, it is what it is, and you just kind of have to bear with it, considering how powerful the Disc of Tzeentch can be, so it definitely makes sense why that one wouldn't be free. But the other war gear being free is definitely a nice little perk to have, and definitely does come into play a little bit in different lists. Moving on to a troop choice for the 1,000 Suns, the only change that they saw was that cultists and Zangors now get their war gear for free, which is once again a nice little perk to have, but not something you really care about, and I don't think it's really going to elevate Zangors to being better than cultists, simply because of the difference within the points cost, so you're probably still going to see the same distribution, where you see the Zangors show up sometimes, but more generally you're probably going to see cultists, where they're just kind of a little bit of a cheaper choice, and they pretty much just function to be annoying on the table by taking objectives or performing other functions that don't really involve them using any of their war gear to really put up a big fight. It's nice to have and can be a little bit of an advantage, but once again, you're not really relying on it in any significant way. Moving on in the unit types, we come to the Elite Choice. The Elite Choice saw a change in 2 different units, the first one being the Hellbrute, seeing a similar change to the Death Guard, where now all of the war gear is free except for the last cannon, which now only costs 10 points. It's a bit of an interesting change, and maybe Thousand Suns can make better use of the Hellbrute than the Death Guard due to their different psychic powers, but at the end of the day, I still don't think it's as particularly interesting as it could be. However, it does give more ability for this unit to show up within different chaos forces, considering that now it's a little bit more interesting, and if you have the extra points, you could play around with it and see how you like it. Though I generally think you're going to have better options and more interesting options in terms of building a list, so I still think it's going to be kind of sidelined by different choices, but at least it's something to consider now, whereas before it was kind of one of those things you kind of forgot about. In any case, the more important change within the elite slot is one that I think is actually pretty good, which is the Zangor Shaman is down by 10 points, going from 70 points to 60 points. This is actually a little bit of a surprising change because the Zangor Shaman did see some reasonable amount of play, as it is a rather cheap caster that is rather mobile thanks to its Disc of Tzeentch, and it does generate Cabal points, so that's always a nice benefit to have, considering that many other units of its nature do not. I think it's a nice little change, and I do think you're going to see the Zangor Shamans a little bit more commonly now, as it's definitely a fine enough unit. It definitely does kind of what you want it to do with its mobility and its ability to cast psychic powers, as well as generating that Cabal point, so it's definitely a very flexible unit, and it's one that I kind of like, and I think it's going to get a little bit more representation as a result of this, so definitely a good change, and one that doesn't really change that much, but it just gives you that little extra bit that pushes it over the top and makes it much more playable. So good change overall, and a nice change to see on a unit that wasn't necessarily the most played and isn't made broken by this change, but definitely increases its playability to a point where you're going to see it more commonly, so that is represented in a good number of lists, which is something we always want to see with units such as this. Moving from the elite choice, we come to a fast attack choice, which saw 1 change in total, being that Chaos Spawner down 2 points total, going from 23 points to 21 points. This is a minor savings, but considering that a lot of Thousand Sun lists did run a unit of 5 of these, and a lot of times included additional Chaos Spawn in addition to that unit of 5, it's definitely going to be something that saves you a little bit of points here and there, and you're going to be saving points on some of that war gear, and potentially something like on the Zangor Shaman, which does give you more ability to take war gear on something like the Scarab Cult Terminators or the Rubric Marines, both of which have pretty decent war gear. And I'll also say this much, considering that the Scarab Cult Terminators are not the most priority target for your durability buffs, now that you can't necessarily as easily sit them in the middle of the table and have them be pretty much unkillable due to the absence of Armor of Contempt, the Chaos Spawn do look a lot more interesting, as you have a lot more justification for buffing them within different games. That being said, at the same time, because the Scarab Cult Terminators are a bit more squishy now, you might still default to buffing them over the Chaos Spawn, so it is one of those things that's a little bit more give and take depending on how you want to play and build your list. But I do like this change, and I think the Chaos Spawn are definitely still an interesting unit, so that's always a good change, considering that they were a good unit but not necessarily a broken unit. Moving on, we come to the heavy support choices. Just like in the Death Guard, the Chaos Predators now have cheaper war gear, but they're still a little boring and I'm not particularly interested in them. The Defiler likewise has gone up from 165 points to 175 points, but has all of its war gear for free now. That might be a little more interesting, but once again, I don't know how much you want to compare to other choices you have within the list, so I still think the Chaos Predators are just a little too boring and the Defiler just isn't particularly good enough, but the Defiler does have a little bit more interest in terms of playability. The other change in the heavy support choice is that the Mutalith Vortex Beast is now down to 130 points instead of 145 points. I'm not super familiar with it. I think I saw it show up in a total of 1 list when I was looking at different lists for Thousand Suns. I will have to revisit that unit because dropping 15 points is a substantial enough points decrease, but depending on what it does, it might still not be good enough. So I'll have to kind of come back to it on a future date just because I kind of think I remember what it does, but I don't 100% remember it at the moment, and I don't want to mislead you guys in terms of how good or bad it might be. There are a couple of other changes, that being that the Rhino and the Land Raider now have all of their war gear for free, which is definitely good if you were already planning to include them within your list, but if you weren't planning to include them, you're still probably not going to take them because these changes don't really push them over the top. they're still a fine choice, and they're definitely made better by this, so if you were planning to include them, you do have more reason to keep them within a list. And finally, the last change that kind of occurred was one that was more to universal rules, being that flyers now start in strategic reserves, which doesn't necessarily hurt the Helldrake significantly, but definitely does make the Helldrake potentially less appealing depending on how you plan to play your list, and the Helldrake wasn't seeing as much play as it was already, so I wouldn't necessarily say that this change really makes you want to take one, but there might be some reasons why you would take one now that it's free to put it within strategic reserves, as it can give it a little bit more durability and not be shot off the table on the first turn if you're going second. So there is a little bit of an upside and a little bit of a downside. Overall, I don't really think it changes how much you care about the Helldrake, but I do think it maybe pushes you a little bit away from it, just because it forces you into a very specific way of playing a unit that you might not necessarily want to play in every single game. And with that being said, we cover all of the changes made to the Thousand Sons directly in this chapter approved. I will say there was one other change that was made to the Chaos Demons that does affect the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons in recent times have very commonly taken a detachment of Zinj Flamers to give them additional firepower, and while this attachment is still possible due to how the rules of Arks of Omen work, they are a little bit weaker in that the Flamers now actually have to roll to hit, so they have become a little bit worse, and once again that's a little bit of a nerf to the Thousand Sons indirectly, because it would normally take that allied detachment in many situations. However, that being said, the allied detachment no longer costs command points, so you do save a little bit in that regard, and in that sense, you do gain a little bit of a buff, so it's a little bit of a trade-off where you lose a little bit and you gain a little bit, though I think overall it's a little bit of a nerf more than a buff. In either case, I do think the Thousand Sons are still in a fine enough spot where they will be a little bit more of a middle-of-the-pack army along with Death Guard and many other armies, because for the most part, the meta for Warhammer 40k is relatively well balanced right now. And I think with a few more tweaks here and there, they can definitely bring things into line where the majority of things are viable and in a very good state. I do think we've had a very good run, although there have been a few slip-ups here and there. It's definitely nothing compared to what we've seen in the past at times, where they were a little bit more hands-off with the rules and certain things persisted for very long times where the game was kind of almost unplayable. In any case, what do you think about these changes? Do you agree or disagree with me? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thank you for watching. See you next time. Have a great one. And don't forget, if you're looking for models, visit the link in the description down below. Thank you for watching. Have a great one and see you next time. Bye.